thank you so much to everyone who came out tonight to hear us speak about the Hong Kong protests. Just to introduce ourselves a bit, I'm Wren and this is Chino. And we're both members of Take Back the Bronx and Unity and Struggle. Take Back the Bronx is a community group organizing around anti-gentrification and community control in the South Bronx. And Unity and Struggle is a nationwide anti-state communist collective organizing in several cities. What we try to do in Unity and Struggle is we try to participate in, understand, study movements for the purposes of collectively strengthening them. And that was our motivation for going to and learning from comrades in Hong Kong. So I'm going to pass around an email sign-up list for UNS if people want to sign up to get emails about events or like podcasts that we're on, for example. And also, we're also in the back if you can check out our literature and our book swag. And as a note, Hong Kong comrades asked us to mail out masks, and if anyone wants to donate to that, there's a bucket for that there. Also, we will be having a Hong Kong comrade, Aldo, joining us on Zoom, which is why there were some technical difficulties earlier, and to share about on-the-ground experiences. And we sort of gave him the hardest question, which is, where's the movement going? So just can we get like a show of hands of like who is here from Hong Kong? Who's from like China, Taiwan, Chinatowns? Yeah. Okay. Who's part of a group that has written in or organized in Hong Kong? So, all right.
We got Made in China journal back there.
Just a little bit more about us. I speak like 5th grade Cantonese and Mandarin, but neither of us reads, so certainly it's a limit for how we can engage in movements. However, we did travel to Hong Kong in November to see the movement there firsthand and have learned from our political contacts and family there and have a better understanding of the Hong Kong protests. So, you know, a huge disclaimer, we're not Hong Kong or China experts, but we hope we can offer our framing as organizers with connections on the ground. So, you know, please let's make this a collective conversation where we can all add our knowledge. Feel free to jump in or you know, flesh things out more if we're getting something wrong. Yeah. So we also wanted to share a list of our comrades and, you know, we've conversed with or writings that we've read that have been sources of understanding for us. So, you know, people can look into further after the talk and see how the Hong Kong left has been thinking further about the protests. We'll put this up at the end again. Just a quick shout out to Chuang, which is one of the sources listed there. We have physical copies of that in the back, and Chuang is like, you know, one of my favorite publications about China and Chinese struggles happening. Okay, so with that, I'll pass it to Chino.
You know, thanks everybody. I feel like we didn't get like claps at the beginning.
Hey!
We were like, yeah, that's happening. Cool. Thank you, everybody. All right, so this will be our outline best we can. What we'll speak about tonight. Start with just like a little movement snapshot. The time that we were in Hong Kong recently was in November, like just as the sieges of the universities started. So we could give a little kind of snapshot of that moment. We can provide some historical background about both Hong Kong and the development of the movement there in the past year. Then we'll throw some of our questions at it. We have like 2 or 3 questions that we walked in with as we were visiting people. And then there's the where could it go. One set of questions is about what constraints does the Chinese state face, and then there's what is the movement going to do, and hopefully Aldo could weigh in on that quite a bit. He'll also have some updates about like what's happened recently in the past couple of months and also with coronavirus. So some commentary there. So our presentation, yeah, it's real. We titled the thing War on the Weekends, partly because that's how some folks that we talked with there describe kind of the rhythm of the movement in Hong Kong. You're talking about maybe now 10, 11, 12 months of protests, 11 months, 10 months, that began over a bill that would have allowed people to be extradited to mainland China out of Hong Kong. And the rhythm of it is described by that phrase. So you have a situation where Maybe there'll be a mass rally of 1 million people one weekend, or something that looks like dispersed rioting across different parts of the city, student strikes, really large blockades going up. And then punctuated by then you go back to work on Monday morning, except maybe some of the MTR stations, which is the subway there, are torched, or daily life is transformed in different ways. So a sustained movement that hovers somewhere short of insurrection but transforms public discourse. It's actually a thing we've been seeing around some of the different uprisings in 2019 in the past year. So in Chile, a similar dynamic occurs. They call it AM country, PM country. Who's followed some of the news in Hong Kong and seen some of the images online? For the most part, it's yeah, that's what I'm showing you. Yeah. It's going to be tough to play this, actually. Hold on just a second. We can loop it. Sorry, I lost my mouse. Yeah, so this is just loop. No, it's okay. I'll put it where it would have been in the QuickTime. It's gonna be there. So this was just like a video we shot one of the last nights that we were around. Let's loop it right. What are some of the images that have grabbed people's attention about Hong Kong that you followed in the media? The Hong Kong protests? It's a question. What are some of the images that have grabbed people's attention? Yeah, please.
Protesters being physically abused by the police.
Being attacked by the police?
Yeah.
And the polarization with police violence over the summer, for sure.
People using the universities.
Universities as a flashpoint.
Mm-hmm. Protesters in masks.
Sure. Masks, gas masks. The intense organization in the street. So you've seen that in little like news feature articles about hand signals and
just seeing like people like the anonymity protected and stuff.
Anonymity in the streets. For sure. What are the things we wrote down? Hand signs, umbrellas, lasers, barricades. The sort of the things that catch a lot of attention. They're impressive features of the movement. We were struck by them too. And are things that are true and occurring. Oh, I'm sorry, I missed one.
The water carry for the people at the front line, where people would sort of pack bricks miles, not miles, but hundreds of people would carry supplies for people at the front line.
Different kinds of human chain and supply to build a barricade or to carry water or to bring bricks out, to cover the street of bricks, for sure. Oh, go ahead, yeah, I'm sorry.
There's this image of bricks glued to the road, thousands of bricks glued to the road. That's that.
Yeah, this area when we were out, this is a section of Nathan Road going up to the police station in the back, and you could kind of see when it swings around, the lasers pointing at the police station. So you had that night sort of a series of barricades down Nathan Road, and then all 1 or 2 blocks in either direction, you had that covered in the little brick, little brick houses. So it's difficult to drive through, difficult to move through. Yeah. We found these really impressive, no doubt. Impressive features of what the movement's able to do in the street. But we were also struck by the fact that the streets are just one expression of what's happening in Hong Kong. And like any mass and sustained uprising on this scale, you get lots of different kinds of activity. So one example, next slide video. So some examples of this, right? Outside of the war on the weekends, you also have websites like LIHKG have become sort of a social media nerve center of discussion. In person, you have these kind of Lenin walls that have popped up. Oops, sorry. These sorts of Lenin walls that we're familiar with in New York. Supporters have also created other things like this Hong Kong Live app that tracks protest activity in real time. You can go up, what's going on tonight, and go show up to it. Student assemblies and some neighborhood associations have formed in some cases, like for example through the group Mongkok on Fire in Mongkok. Small businesses have polarized, right? Though like young people and students are sort of the vanguard, you could say, or like the leading edge of what's going on, small businesses are polarized between yellow shops that are aligned with the movement and blue shops that oppose them, and then in a yellow shop, you could run in if something's going on and flush tear gas out of your eyes or something. And then there's these sort of extended networks of support, both donations for different kinds of supplies, but also older people, for example, finding homes for younger people who've been kicked out of their houses for participating in the movement, or subsidizing like meal tickets so they can eat. And sometimes, in some cases, very young protesters, right, teenagers or something, get kicked out of their homes. So there's this range of different activity. All of that right now, at least since June or July, has been united around the basic platform of 5 demands. It's always 5 demands, not one less. But some of the ambiguity is interesting. The 5 are withdraw the extradition bill immediately, which was the initial spark for the protests, and actually has been achieved. 2 is retract the riot label, the label of the protests as riots. 3 is a sort of amnesty for people arrested and charged in the course of the movement. 4 is an independent inquiry into police violence, which has been this continual flashpoint, right, and gotten even more brutal, and live ammo began being used in the fall. 5 is sometimes, I've read different versions, and others could correct me if I'm wrong. I've read some that are Carrie Lam should resign immediately, who's the chief executive of the Legislative Council in Hong Kong. I've read others that are the version up here, which is dissolve the Legislative Council and give us universal suffrage, which, as we'll speak about in a little bit, the form of government in Hong Kong, it's a post-colonial form of government that has never really achieved like the whatever quote-unquote free bourgeois democracy. And Lausan is a great publication that's written quite a bit about this. You also see, in some cases, you see this graffiti. It says 5 demands, not one less, and then someone's crossed it out and written 6. So then sometimes there's some flirtation with what are other demands that the movement's going to put forward, and the 6th is sometimes like dissolve the police, or like abolish the police department or something. So again, the centrality of police in the sort of a radicalization about what the movement is about, even as it's moving, rolling forward. So to explain how this came about, like how did we wind up in this sort of situation, that we got to do a little history.
So just for the purposes of understanding the current movement better, we're just covering some parts, like some significant points in Hong Kong's history. I think as many of y'all know, Hong Kong's history differs from mainland in that it became a British colony as a concession of the Opium War, and the legacy of colonization and its infrastructures continues to play out in this moment. And jumping into the 20th century, there's a mass migration from mainland in the post-war period as a result of the Chinese Civil War between the Communist Party and the Kuomintang, and then also after the subsequent victory of the Communist Party. And I bring up this mass migration just as an important point in thinking about who are Hong Kongers. For the most part, most people are not indigenous to Hong Kong and can trace their family roots to either southern China or other parts of China. I just think it's important to think about in terms of the current movement. Moving forward, in the 60s, in the 1966 and 1967, there were massive riots that happened. As a result of post-war industrialization, major flashpoints have been around factory work conditions and also the cost of transit during that time period. There's a general sense of unrest and unhappiness with British colonization and the police repression of that movement. And at that time, there's a leftist understanding of Hong Kong through anti-colonial lens, with communist cadre agitating in factories. As a result of those movements and leftist organizing subsequently, the government responds by creating social protections and expanding public housing. It's the beginnings of what we see today with public housing in Hong Kong. More than 50% of people live in public housing in Hong Kong. Another major concession that is later implemented is the 1984 reform of the Legislative Council. Just a bit of background on the Legislative Council, since it's important in current protests, is that it was originally just an advisory board to the colonial governor. And after 1997, the handover and the one country, two systems policy, Beijing has the ability to override local Hong Kong laws and decisions. So to some degree, the Legislative Council does not hold as much weight as one would like. And today, there are 75 members, half are elected, the other half represent Hong Kong's economic interests. So they represent banks, the tourism sector, for example. Maybe it's similar to like revenue here. And popular votes usually swing 60% pro-democracy and 40% pro-Beijing, just to give you a sense. And there's a little diagram there showing how LegCo is split up. Just going back in the timeline a bit, in the 70s, what we see is Hong Kong emerging as a financial capital, and with the financialization of Hong Kong, we see the emergence of the economic policies that still plague Hong Kong. Hong Kong is the world, quote unquote, the world's freest economy, which means that there's no government oversight of corporations. There's little to no taxations of corporations and capitalists. So just to bring up to show some of the contradictions that Hong Kong holds. In the 80s, we see continued deindustrialization with the economic opening of mainland China and Hong Kong capitalists moving factories over to Shenzhen, which is the first special economic zone that China creates. So like I mentioned, in 97, Hong Kong returns to China, and we also see leftists rethinking Hong Kong's relationship with mainland, especially with the rise of the Chinese economy. A couple examples of that is we see labor activism emerging in the 90s with an orientation to mainland factory working conditions, as well as in the 2010s a concern around development of Hong Kong for the purposes of Hong Kong's role in relationship to mainland. So we see that with the protests around the Guangzhou-Hong Kong Express Rail Link. And also as a last example, in 2013, there's a huge dock worker strike that lasts like over 40 days, and that's the latest example in Hong Kong's recent history of a major labor struggle. So what is just important to glean from the post-97 return period is that with Hong Kong's return to China, China basically inherits a lot of the political and financial infrastructures of the colonial system.
Cool, so my next 40 minutes will be speaking through every point on this time. No, I won't do that. I won't read everything, but you can kind of read through some of the text to get a sense of the major events over the last year. And this is just a few of them, right? If you look at even just the Wikipedia timelines, there's tons and tons and tons of activity. But kind of a weird thing for a 2019 timeline, it starts in 2014. And that's partly because the Occupy Central and really umbrella movement sets sort of a lot of the stage for what eventually breaks out in the past year, and that's useful to explain. So when there's some sort of reform package that might be passed to say democratize the Legislative Council, right? Maybe expand the positions that are directly voted on or something like that. It has to be, it could be overridden by Beijing, so you might as well just negotiate it with Beijing before the vote happens. So in the last major reform package is being debated around this time in 2014 into 2015. Others that know the timeline of this movement better should jump in and add things. But my understanding is at least that's a moment when you see the Occupy Central encampment in central Hong Kong saying basically we're going to put some street heat on these negotiations to advocate for universal suffrage in the legislature, which then spills out when sort of a negotiated deal happens. There's a lot of infighting and debate over the terms of that deal, and Occupy Central sort of spawns the umbrella movement, which takes a few different encampments in different parts of the city, and also entails a split between, on the one hand, people that are more oriented toward negotiation and maybe electing parties into the Legislative Council to do that sort of negotiation, and on the other hand, the emergence of a little more direct action based or open to clashes with the police sort of tendency. But that ends in 2015. So in 2019, you can see extradition bill is introduced in April, and the character of what happens is sort of shaped as if it picked up where umbrella movement kind of left off. The common sense is much more oriented toward direct action in the streets, kind of a refusal of having groups come in and advocate for different political parties. Over the course of the summer, you can see it opens up with large mass marches. The police brutality dynamic kicks up. During the summer, there's an attempt to offer some concessions. The bill is tabled but not withdrawn. At the same time, the triads, basically the mafia, attack some protesters in Yulong. So it's still unknown exactly what are the forces behind that, right? Whereas if the bill had maybe been withdrawn at that moment, maybe everything would have gone quiet. But at that point, your 5 demands come out, and the movement is sort of radicalizing faster than concession, carrot and stick can contain it. You can see into the fall, there's a student strike in September. Into the fall in October, the bill is actually withdrawn, but now there's a sort of a broadening sense of what the struggle is even about. The movement continues. There's an attempted general strike around the time that we were there, which gives way to the sieges in the universities, which got a lot of international attention. Most recently, in December, you got sort of a sweep for the pro-democracy parties in the district council, which isn't a legislative council. Doesn't mean that much, but it's symbolically significant. They decide a small number of seats that go in the functional constituencies alongside the bankers and the real estate interests and the industrialists. And then still, right around New Year's, you had another major mass march and also an interesting turn towards sign-ups for trade unions, which Aldo will talk about in a little minute.
With that, we'll move on to our questions that we came to Hong Kong with. And just before delving into these questions, I just wanted to sort of give a summary of some of our assumptions or inclinations that we went in with. I think based on our previous readings and also having engaged in struggle in America, these are some of our assumptions. So, we believe that China is a capitalist state, not a socialist one, and we feel it's unfair to see Hong Kong protests at face value, meaning that it's only over political demands and over bourgeois rights and not economic ones. We do not believe movements are static and see the potential for movements to become more revolutionary. We believe political and economic issues are deeply interconnected and become fused together through struggle. We are interested in the subjectivity of movements and the changing social relations and organizations that take place. We had more questions than this, but we sort of had to nix it for time. So the first one of our questions is just who is involved and why. Speaking to the subjectivity of movements that we're interested in. Also, how is the movement defining its means and aims? What is the relationship between political and economic concerns? And what is the movement's relationship with struggles on the mainland for the first part? Yeah. So as we might all know from international coverage, a large portion of the movement has been middle school to college students. Major moments have been the student strike in September and also university sieges in late fall. During the summer 2019, students mobilized against the criminalization of protests with significant flashpoints around policing. For the movement, police violence is the most tangible expression of the lack of a political autonomy, erosion of civil liberties, and impasse with the 5 demands. As the movement evolves, we see the blossoming of organizing through student organizers at Chinese University, which has a more liberal or left legacy, as well as other universities, encouraging and supporting organizing by autonomous groups in secondary schools to create student strikes. We see the creation and linking up of different networks of students to create the student strike and also to respond to the death of a student in protests. So this is some photos of that. And why has there been such sustained involvement from students? I think we have to understand the Hong Kong education system a bit more. While the Hong Kong education system is largely public and state subsidized, which sounds good here in New York, there are significant hurdles for working class students. With an intensely rigorous and competitive public examination system that implicitly requires familial financial investment in extracurriculars. Most students around the poverty line actually end up in sub-degree programs and don't end up in universities. Also, compared to the 90s, the earning from attending universities has decreased significantly. It used to be, I think, 70%, and now it's only at 30%, 37% of university graduates earning more than a secondary, only 37% of university graduates earn more than secondary school degrees. So the financial, the financial incentive to go to college is lessening. So it is, it's very telling to us that when we're chatting with our Hong Kong comrades about what politicized or radicalized us, they talk about the school system and they talk about failing or coming up against its limits as a defining moment of their formation of their political consciousness. And maybe Hong Kongers could speak more on this. And while the movement consists of people of most backgrounds, from silver-haired groups as they call themselves, so like older folks in the far right, to people in the finance sector, the quote-unquote white bloc, etc., and those sorts of, those folks and also those sections of the movement have been financially important for sustaining the movement for so long, but working class youth have continued to play a critical role, especially on the streets. Geographically, the protests started in, the business hub or the financial and shopping hub of Hong Kong, but they've expanded to working class neighborhoods and neighborhoods close to the border with mainland. And there have been major clashes or organizing in more industrial working class neighborhoods such as Kwun Tong, Kwai Sing, Kwai Chung, Chuan, and Mong Kok. And some of those neighborhoods, according to the Hong Kong census, have a lower rates of owner-occupied households, meaning folks are probably renters or in public housing. Just for example, well, I guess today technically, or yesterday, there were anti-government protests and subsequent arrests in Kwai Chung, one of the neighborhoods I just mentioned, which has the largest public housing estate in Hong Kong. I think also important to talk about is who isn't at the protests. For the most part, we don't see non-Han Chinese folks involved in the protests. For folks who don't know, compared to New York or other global cities, 92% of Hong Kongers are ethnic Han Chinese and only 8% are people of other races. The majority of the minority of folks are domestic workers from Southeast Asia as well as South Asia and African folks. And certainly there's a bit of sympathy with by minorities in Hong Kong with the movement, because for the first time, Han Chinese folks could possibly relate to the police violence that ethnic minorities and Muslims have been facing in Hong Kong on an everyday basis. So, temporary non-permanent resident female migrant workers from the Philippines and Indonesia make up 10% of the working population in Hong Kong. And I don't want to go too much into it, and there has been a lot of organizing around it, but work conditions for domestic workers are really terrible and unregulated. There's been sustained organizing around that. So there's some notable exceptions of people who have participated, some domestic migrant workers that have participated in the movement, and Lawson has translated a piece about an Indonesian journalist and domestic worker who got deported. But I think, just going back to my point, I think what detracts non-Han Chinese folks from being a part of the movement is that the movement discourse has been centered around a Hong Konger identity, which is heavily implied to be a Han Chinese exclusive category. Part of the sentiments around the movement is about maintaining Hong Kong culture, and a large part of that is, Cantonese and Cantonese culture. With the movement demands on paper, it has been focused on political autonomy and bourgeois rights as a Hong Konger, meaning as a permanent resident, which already excludes domestic workers who are temporary residents and cannot become permanent residents. And these are limits that certainly the movement can hopefully confront and overcome, perhaps by addressing economic demands more explicitly.
So that connects with the question of how is the movement defining what it's about? What the movement is about shapes who participates in it and why, right? So how is the movement defining its meanings and aims? There's this 5 demands, which is the continual kind of, repeated watchword. But it seems like underneath that, there's a pretty rich dialogue going on over what this is about and why, where it's going. And part of the way that discussion happens is shaped by the umbrella movement. So one of our comrades, when we were hanging out one night, I was trying to remember exactly what he said. Phrase like no disagreement, no split, something like that, which we're familiar with, kind of like diversity of tactics or something, right? In other words, the idea is stay united behind the 5 demands, don't get stuck in debates over strategy, do whatever you think is appropriate to achieve this, the agreed upon program. That's why, for example, it's sort of socially unacceptable to come repping some other sort of program. You don't really see groups showing up in the street with signs, banners, a separate pamphlet about their awesome groups program and why you should sign up for them. That's become kind of socially unacceptable. That's partly why when you see boosted in the media, the far right localist groups marching with their own sets of flags. They are actually somewhat marginal in the street, though they're maybe quicker and more active on social media and getting in social media. But it's also at the same time why the left doesn't have that sort of presence in the street. And when we were talking with comrades, there's a sense of like hesitancy, or you're just not sure, how exactly to engage other than showing up and participating. So this norm, the no disagreement, no split, I was thinking of it as it's an example of what the communization milieu, if folks are familiar with these like wacky far left communizationists, what they call an internal limit. It's not just a negative, right? It's a positive and a negative. It's an enabling condition and a constraint which would have to be overcome for the movement to develop in a new form. On the one hand, non-sectarianism enables this kind of immediate sense of unity in the streets. It sustained the movement for this long. On the other hand, it also sidelines these explicit debates about what could be potentially contradictory courses of action. And so then you see that with capitalist common sense kind of can sneak in the back end, right? Which is why probably most people would think intervention or like support from the international community is a good thing. But the international community is assumed to be like the UN, maybe the United States, rather than like the working class or something, right? Oh yeah, that's a good story actually. Thank you for reminding me. So we were hanging out in Hong Kong. So we got to meet the folks. Have folks read that Pretty Good Crime Think piece in Hong Kong? We were hanging out with the authors of the piece, and very interesting anarchists, right? And they were saying, we've been sort of agitating for years for people to take up insurrectionary street tactics, and lo and behold, a mass movement has done that spontaneously. It's taken it and run with it. And it was like, I never thought I'd say this, but I feel the movement needs less tactics and more ideology. Like, wow, that's the thing. What's the movement about? Not ideology and program. Those are just on-paper crystallizations of what people understand the meaning of the struggle to be. That's the discussion that maybe needs to happen. These debates do emerge naturally in the course of struggle, of course. Oftentimes it happens in the context of debates over tactics or behavior in the street, which actually Chuang mentioned in a good article recently. Op-ed in the New York Times, yeah. So there, for example, there's I'm told lots of ongoing conversation on LIHKG over how much violence is too much in this specific case, or how men and women should relate in the streets, or what terms are appropriate terms to refer to mainlanders. All these discussions have to make some kind of argument about why a given practice is appropriate or inappropriate. And usually that's premised on some idea about how it contributes to or hinders the movement's aims, right? It's a strategic discussion implicitly happening through tactics or through ethics. And we should be familiar with that in New York, right? Because anytime, the FTP marches recently, right? The race politics, black liberation, how to fight white supremacy, those political, theoretical, and strategic discussions are happening through debates about how white people and people of color should relate in the streets in the course of the march. Very similar dynamic. Now that doesn't mean it's all online. These sort of in-person venues are popping up as well. So this is the photo again of the student assembly that Wren went to. Much like maybe in Chile or Puerto Rico, often after an initial win, like getting the bill removed, right? People are sort of compelled to get together and reflect on what's the next step, what's the way forward. And that's starting to happen in in-person venues too, since maybe at least October. And my sense is I'd be curious what others think. My impression was it'll become more pressing for the movement to have these kinds of debates and discussions that move from a tactical and ethical sort of level to the longer term. Because in the meantime, my impression was you're at a kind of stalemate. The movement can get the extradition bill withdrawn, but can't necessarily, isn't in a position to force Beijing to accept universal suffrage in Hong Kong. Beijing, for reasons that maybe we'll discuss in a minute, isn't in a position to totally crush Hong Kong. And in that space, then you get a kind of, I guess we're just fighting to the death or fatalism, which is there in this the line from freaking Hunger Games is everywhere, like spray painted all along Nathan Road, right? If we burn, you burn with us. You're surrounded in a university for weeks on end, and maybe you're going to get killed or, seriously beat up and charged with something, and they're spraying, if we burn, you burn with us all over everything. And students are sometimes signing actually little wills before clashes, like I might be killed today, but we just have to not go down quietly. That's a strong sentiment, but also one that doesn't have a real futurity, like where's this thing going, what's the end game? Okay, question number C. Question letter C. So we made this outline recently. What's the relation between political and economic concern? Like movements we've seen in other places, Algeria, Chile, Lebanon, the movement in Hong Kong is fighting against a sense of the future being foreclosed. I didn't know the statistic about you have 2/3 chance of earning as much as if you just didn't go to college and went to high school. And similarly, it's doing so in a context in which contracting economic opportunity is kind of inseparable from political authoritarianism. The two are fused, they're the same issue, right? Hong Kong has its own unique features. Unlike the other places that rose up in 2019, Hong Kong, its version of authoritarianism is not like a crony capitalist regime run by a bunch of cousins. It's this post-colonial system that's been inherited by China, right? That's run by a party that calls itself socialist. Its ticking clock is not that the same guy is going to run for president for the 20th time. It's that China is going to, cancel the one country, two systems policy in 2047. It's also an outlier because it's much more wealthy than the other places that rose up in 2019. But it also suffers from some of the highest levels of inequality in the world. That's at the Lausanne event, right? It was like the Gini coefficient of Hong Kong is second only to freaking New York in terms of inequality. And some of the highest rents in the world, which is pretty tough when you're a young person and you might not earn as much as, you might have just stayed in high school. It's a reason why many young people leave Hong Kong. So in this case, Hong Kong has a political trigger, like in Algeria when they were going to roll out Bouteflika's corpse to run for president again. The political trigger in this case is the extradition bill. But it's also been fueled by economic anxieties, and maybe it'll be increasingly compelled to grapple with those more directly. You see that in slogans like this. If you can read this one here. It says $7,000 Hong Kong dollars for a house like a cell, and you really think we're out here scared of jail? Part of what makes the political issue pressing is the fact that the economic conditions are so unlivable. The state acknowledges this implicitly, so when Carrie Lam finally pulled the bill, she also offered a set of housing concessions. Right? Wasn't part of the 5 demands, but they know that's an underlying fuel, right, for participation in the protests. Most leftists that we spoke with kind of assume that, right, political freedoms are going to be a condition for success in any of the struggles around labor rights or development that have been ongoing since the 2000s. And I'd argue maybe regular folks on the street do the same thing when they argue for the importance of the political struggle in Hong Kong by pointing to the economic condition of Chinese workers. Now, sometimes there's like a condescending language sometimes toward mainlanders, right? But people will be like, workers in China are like slaves. We don't want to be reduced to that condition. It's a sense of the political condition and the economic condition being entwined. So these issues may become more central as the movement is forced to confront this challenge of waging strikes. Like you saw in the timeline, there were a couple moments of general strikes, or maybe attempted general strikes, biggest one in August. And that's similar to other places in 2019 too. A mass anti-regime protest kind of pulls the trade unions and forces them to like get on the fucking bus, and support a general strike. Now, if that happens in Chile, the trade unions are then negotiating over writing a new constitution and having a constituent assembly. In Hong Kong, it doesn't play out like that. The unions aren't in a position to play that kind of role. The HKCTU, which is the major trade union federation that mobilized people, it doesn't have a super strong tradition of struggle. Aldo can speak about this a little more. Union density is lower. They're competing with pro-Beijing federations. And after the attempted general strikes, a lot of people get fired. actually pretty notably a bunch of Cathay Airlines workers get fired, and so then there have to be a lot of support measures. So you see class struggle for people taking action as workers happening on an individual level. Like we were told, like bus drivers will like pull the bus diagonal across the intersection before abandoning it. Yeah, I kept working protest, but I blocked the whole intersection. The teacher won't teach the required loyalty curriculum part. We'll just drop that. But those are individual acts. And maybe there will be some compulsion for some sort of collective, what we would think of as maybe like collective class organization through the experience. And we'll speak a little more about that later. There's been like a big sign up into trade unions, like a mass sign up into trade unions toward the end of 2019.
Our fourth question is, what is the movement's relationship with struggle on mainland? Just because, like China's a huge territory and there's like other stuff happening, and as comrades from the International Marxist Tendency have insisted, the fate of Hong Kong hinges on a lot of what happens throughout the rest of China. So, not to go too much into it, but obviously there are massive protests happening in China, since the 2000s around a lot of various issues, such as like working conditions, the pressures of deindustrialization in the Pearl River Delta, for example, land seizures, environmental concerns, etc. But unfortunately, right now it's hard to tell how struggles in Hong Kong and mainland can inform each other. Internet censorship of social movements has always been pretty heavy. Human rights and labor movements have experienced heavy crackdowns. With a lot of people still incarcerated. Internet censorship of news about the Hong Kong protests has been pretty extensive, with posts being taken down and several cases in which netizen activists have been arrested for quote-unquote picking quarrels for their social media posts in support of Hong Kong. Official media has consistently framed the city as a disobedient child who will soon come to terms with in its senses. Online spammers, some likely state-sponsored, while others are independent Chinese nationalist trolls, have also worked to frame protests as a conspiracy of foreign powers. As Zoe Chow, who presented at the Wasan event a month ago, has pointed out, there's online discussion happening on platforms such as Pingtong, which is the example on the far left. Even with my 5th grade, Chinese, you can see it's about Hong Kong. Let's see. And you see this is an example of that was posted on Pingtong, which is like people from other universities in China showing solidarity with university students in Hong Kong by showing like something that they have that shows that they go to that school. Yeah, and then like a note is saying like, keep on it. Okay. But you kind of have to be pretty tech savvy with VPNs to access sites like that. So, they tend to be much smaller audiences and skew more liberal or civil libertarian. And obviously there's also, as we've mentioned before, there's direct relationships between leftists in Hong Kong and mainland. Activists in Hong Kong have, supported labor activism in the mainland since the 90s. However, these kinds of labor networks, aside from being comparatively small, are also getting severely repressed across China since the JSIC incident in 2018, in which students and workers were arrested for organizing in a factory. So it would be dangerous to, for example, organize a public event or circulate publications about Hong Kong through these networks. And given that it's hard to have any public or online expression about Hong Kong, most people's opinions would have to be shared through, veiled statements like this or else in private. So it's actually very hard to judge how Hong Kong's will influence struggle so far, and perhaps we might see it now with, mainland popular dissent of the state handling of the corona health crisis. Yeah. And this last one was just a photo from a land seizure in Wuhan, which is one of the cities. Wait, I think,
Before coronavirus outbreak, sort of contemporaneous with Hong Kong struggle, there was a fight in Wuhan about
An incinerator that was built.
So, where could it go? Our kind of, I think, our last question. So, as Chino said, there's two parts of the question that we see. It's just sort of like what sort of constraints the Chinese state faces, and also how will the movement respond. So, obviously we know the Chinese state wants to suppress the protests. The overwhelming power of the CCP is an issue looming over the movement, especially with the memory of the 1989 Tiananmen Square crackdown. So we see this when, like in the People Liberation Army, they have like barracks, they have a small barracks in Hong Kong, and they came out to like clean the garbage, and everyone was like really angry about that. It's like, you're not supposed to leave the barracks, like don't clean garbage, and rightfully so. So the big question is like, what constraints will the state face in exercising its power, and which will provide the movement breathing room and initiative? So from our perspective, we can see three. First, the party is actively trying to build its hegemony internationally and sustain it domestically. Internationally, the focus has been on the Belt and Road Initiative, which plans to create is creating infrastructure projects in the quote-unquote global South. The effort is partly economic. Right now, China has its lowest GDP growth rate since the 90s, and exporting excess capital is a strategy to give lagging Chinese accumulation a lease on life. And it's also partly geostrategic, aiming to establish sea and land routes that will allow the Chinese state to project economic and military power internationally and compete with US domination. So we see this with Chinese investment in Sri Lanka, for example, in creating a port in southern Sri Lanka, which is obviously geographically very important for sort of control of that area. And also another key part is ideological. In order to be accepted as an alternative to existing imperialist powers by subordinate countries, China needs to present itself as economically growing and politically benevolent. So we see this in sort of how Chinese representatives sometimes represent Belt and Road to state representatives in Africa or Latin America. They sort of call it like kind of global South, quote unquote, global South to global South solidarity. Anyway, so widely repressing an urban uprising in ways that could sacrifice economic stability to the political rule might not play well for Beijing's aspiring partnerships. And second, a similar set of concerns exists domestically. Here too, the party is dealing with a slowing economy and inequality that pose challenges to the plausibility of Xi's China dream, in which limited political freedoms are balanced by economic opportunities. And there's a real risk that Hong Kong could become an example to cities in mainland who have grievances about being the collateral damage of economic growth. For example, around the land seizures we've mentioned before, and environmental issues, such as what happened in Wuhan in July, sort of before the coronavirus outbreak, which is also challenging state legitimacy.
Oh, third one, the money one. In addition, Hong Kong's role as a financial center remains really vital to the Chinese economy. This was actually, it was debated in sort of like dueling news articles toward the end of the year, right? Like what's going to happen in Hong Kong and how important is it to mainland. Some authors have pointed out, and it's totally true, Hong Kong has been eclipsed in many ways. Shanghai has its own stock market. Import-export of goods happens through many other places. And of course, like the GDP of China as a whole now dwarfs Hong Kong, which was not always the case. All that's totally true. But at the same time, Hong Kong is still the main financial conduit between mainland and the rest of the global economy. So Hong Kong stock market remains pretty much the only place where foreigners can freely invest in stocks from mainland companies or bonds from mainland government entities. Chinese companies sometimes sell their stocks on foreign exchanges, but that actually takes a lot of like negotiation and know-how. So a good example of this is like Alibaba did its IPO, $11.2 billion IPO in the Hong Kong Stock Exchange in November, where there was fucking tear gas flying through the streets, because that's still the most viable place to do so. You can see some of the numbers up there, right? Overall, I mean, that goes back to 97, but vast majority of IPOs of Chinese firms happen in the Hong Kong stock market, bond issuances, foreign direct investment into China, and China outward, like for example through Belt and Road, happen through Chinese banks. You need those financial institutions to make those things viable. And in addition, we didn't put it up there, but the Hong Kong dollar is still viewed as sort of the most reliable currency in which to trade Chinese assets like that. Beijing wants the RMB to replace it eventually, but it's not in a position to do so right now. So still, that means that Hong Kong is this kind of crucial economic node for the Chinese state. The city itself may sink into recession, and it has, but the party still needs its institutions and its financial infrastructure to be stable enough to allow it to keep serving this role. Oh yeah, okay. So that completes our part. The big next question is, if these are the constraints that the Chinese state faces, what will the movement do with the maneuvering room that it has? We had some ideas about that, but we thought Aldo, who's zooming in from Hong Kong, could speak on it. Yes, you're still there. He's been like sitting, waiting patiently. Like in the early morning, is like freaking like 8 a.m. He woke up at 6 to get on this Zoom call. Let's see if we can make the sound work.
Hi everyone. I think you have to mute the channel first.
Yo, this actually works. Go ahead.
Yeah. Oh, okay. Hi everyone. Thank you for including me in this activity. So let me explain and introduce myself and my group very briefly. First, I come from WorkerCom, which is Logongzhou, with a very new group, a small group formed in 2018. Because of some previous reason, we decided to abandon the NGO models of working on things, and therefore we have no staff, and all of us are making use of our spare times after work to participate in different kinds of movement. And our members are coming from different sectors, include some of us are NGO workers like me, and some other people are freelancers or from food industry, temporary workers, and office worker or something else. And the way we handle the labor disputes is we prefer the direct actions and online negotiation instead of like in the past handling the complaints through the court cases, because the Hong Kong judicial system, especially on labor dispute, is highly inefficient. That is a very simple labor dispute will cost workers for more than half year to have the case completed, and the court is highly unfavorable for workers because it will take their times, and the judges actually do not have a very pro-labor position, and that's why we are developing some strategies on how to facilitate the workers to confront their bosses directly. But besides taking part in the labor movement, our group is also actively joining the anti-extradition bill struggle since June last year. So because we're just a small group and we have some experience in labor issues, so we chose several aspects of work, like some street exhibition and screening of police brutalities footages in the streets, and then we established a small strike fund which try to set up as a model for other unions to follow as a way to support protesters who take part in this struggle. And on the other hand, we are trying to help some workers who are repressed by bosses because of political reasons. And on the other hand, there are lots of labor issues related to the struggle. Say, for example, during the street clashes, there are tear gas and the police charging against everyone and creates a lot of dangers. But at that time, some people still have to work on the sites of protests, like the cleaning workers or the frontline shopkeepers, and they create quite serious work safety issues. And yeah, at that time we did something about it. And for myself, I've been taking part mostly at labor movement and independence media. But on the other hand, I'm also very interested in some environmental and social issues which are related to infrastructure projects. It is because it is quite a huge issue in Hong Kong in the past decades, because our government is investing hundreds of billions of US dollars in order to build some infrastructure mega projects which are connecting Hong Kong to China. But that is not really facilitating needs of people, but instead they are trying to assimilate Hong Kong and China to facilitate further business connections. And yeah, and this is creating a lot of social problems in Hong Kong, which is, for example, forced evacuations in a lot of communities, while at the same time it wastes our public resources to something which is not related to people's need. And what we need is something like expanding the public housing and public health system, and also education instead of this kind of bridges or high-speed railways. And yeah, this is my context. So in the past several months, there are some other comrades interviewing me about the recent struggle. So if you are interested in that, you can have a look in these two interview articles. Okay, so let's start. I'm not going to talk a lot, and I will only talk about three recent developments in Hong Kong. So the first one is the something related to the landslide victory in the district council, so which is in 24th of November. So if we're looking at outside, you may think that it is a huge blow to the government, but actually it is not quite the case for several reasons. First of all, the ratio of pro-struggle and pro-government people is still unchanged, which is about 60% to 40%. But on the other hand, the pro-struggle candidates took 86% of seats. The reason is because the district council election is a winner-takes-all way of elections, but on the other hand, it shows that the attitude of pro-struggle as a majority is a major trend in Hong Kong. No matter no matter the electoral region is a rich or poor region, or no matter it is urban or rural region, or no matter it is near the city center or is near the Hong Kong Chinese border. But on the other hand, it is actually not a big deal to the government. The reason is because the district council do not have much power, so they are not lawmakers, and they can only decide on some very minor issues. In, say, for example, several $1 million for the regional expenditure, but that is just a tiny part in the whole budget. The reasons of some elected bodies having such a limited power is actually a remnant of the colonial time. The district council is one of the many statutory bodies which were created by the British government before 1997, and it is a way invented by the British colonists as a way to buy local elites. That we have a term called administrative absorption of politics. That is, the government is appointing some local elites to help them to rule this colony, and in this case they can avoid a direct relationship with the ordinary people, and it is a way of indirect route through some local elites. And by this way, actually, the government can decide on a lot of important public issues without the decision by some elected body by the general public, which include the whole financial reserve of Hong Kong, and all the public housing, all the public hospital, and the airport, the urban redevelopment projects, and the registration of doctors, and many other issues are all decided by this kind of statutory body. So it is actually a highly undemocratic system in Hong Kong, which although setting up by the British colonial government, but after 1997, this system is still expanding. Not only in the scale of these bodies and the expenditure related to these bodies, but on the other hand, the number of these kind of bodies is also increasing, and partly because of the trends of privatization. But on the other hand, the landslide victory in the district council is actually do matter in local politics. partly it is because the district council, although has very limited power, it can still fund some local organizations. And with the landslide victory, we will be able to cut the fundings of pro-government satellite organizations, which in the past are making use of the public money to buy a lot of gifts to the local residents in order to buy their votes. And on the other hand, because of the fundings being cut, there are now conflicts within the pro-government camp. Because even the pro-government political parties will blame the Hong Kong government for proposing the extradition bill, which leads to such a defeat. And on the other hand, it is quite a positive development to local politics, because now there are a lot of new candidates and voters, and many of them do not have affiliates with traditional political parties, and because of it, now the local politics are having higher transparency, and the quality of meetings in the district council is better. And actually, maybe to some of you it sounds very strange, but the fact in Hong Kong is that the district council in the past, because the pro-government camps is in majority, the meetings can be have a very low attendance rate, and the minutes are taken only very briefly and only in hard copy, so the general public cannot access to this kind of information, and that is what's happened in just several months ago. But on the other hand, because the pro-struggle politicians are now being the majority in this body, the government are becoming highly uncooperative. So this is one part of the recent development. And the second part is, Chino already mentioned something about that. It is a wave of political unionization. And it is not only unionization, but political unionization, because before 2019, union is not considered by most of the people in Hong Kong. Our union coverage is just less than 5%, including the Democratic Union and the pro-China union. And we only have 0 to 2 strikes per year. Actually, the number is tiny. And in the past, in the past decade, the mainstream media and the general public do not support strike, because they only think that the workers are asking for too much or creating some public trouble. Okay, so you can ask for more salaries, but please don't create trouble for me, or if you hate your job so much, just resign. Why you have to create so much trouble? And this is what the general public's attitude towards labor movement is past. But in recent years, the public becomes more sympathetic because of some social problems, which already mentioned by Wren and Chino. And in 2019, because the protesters want to try whatever means to win the struggle, some of them are considering strike is an effective method, partly because the logic is actually very straightforward and simple, but not following the line of traditional labor struggle. That is, many protesters are very straightforward to believe that, okay, when we call for a strike, then we can free a lot of people from work, and then they can come to take the streets. And that is exactly what happened in the 12th of June. And later, as the struggle developed, people start to think that strike is a very good way to create trouble, because besides freeing the people to go to the streets to make blockades or whatever actions, it will also bring huge economic impacts. And this can be the best example is, of course, in the 11th to 18th of November, when people begin to block the road all over Hong Kong, and people all over Hong Kong take action in order to rescue Chinese University and Polytechnic University. On the whole week, the whole city almost paralyzed, because there are roadblocks all over the cities. And a trip from northern part of Hong Kong to the city center, which usually takes 45 minutes, now becomes 4 hours. So which means that practically people cannot go to work. So, but on the other hand, during the strike, some of the unions are repressed, and some people who took part in the strike are fined by the police. So fined by the boss. So people are getting more and more realize the importance of unions, and that's why there's such a wave of unionization, and that's why I call it a political unionization, because the aim to form this kind of union and join the union is politically driven. And in this wave, it is mostly white-collar and professionals creating new unions, and these are exactly the people which, in the past, we are not able to organize. So, by December 2019, there are more than 30 new unions registering, including the hospital workers who already strike for 1 week last week, and the government workers, the metro workers who are going to strike in the coming days, the accountants, architecture, beauty salon, and many other different kinds. And interestingly enough, and a very unexpected development is that the outbreak of coronavirus actually speeds up the process. Just more than 1 month ago, I personally believe that the unionization won't be fast, and it is a very good way to develop the strength of resistance in long term. But because of coronavirus is generating a huge public anger and panic, the new unions are very quickly taking action and expanding very quickly, which I will talk about it later. And the third kind of recent development I want to introduce is economic circle and mutual help circle among the protesters, which never existed in the past. So now, since June, people are choosing shops which support the struggles. Say, for example, since June 2019, some shops along the way of the demonstration march post some slogans in front of the shops, say that we support you, or we are anti the extradition bill, and those kinds of shops are becoming very, very, very popular, and people are eager to wait for 3 hours to have a meal, to have a dinner there. So, and as the struggle is developing, there are more and more shops doing something similar. And there are shops who hire the protesters or people who lost their job because of the struggle, and they provide trainings to the young protesters who may lose their job in the future, and they donate to some of the organization and hosting propaganda. Say, for example, this is one of the very typical shops in this style. So there are propaganda all over, outside and inside the shops. And this now the people are collecting a list of this kind of shops, and they even created an app. They even create an app to help people to identify which shop supports the struggle, and please go there. So you can see that the yellow ones are those which are supporting the struggle, the blue ones are anti-struggles, and the green ones are not sure. So yeah, but this is just on the consumer level. I think this part is interesting enough, because in the past, for more than 1 decade, when we are talking about corporate social responsibility or conscious buying or criticizing some multinational companies like Uniqlo, H&M, Adidas, or Nike, we are always criticized by the people because they love this kind of brands, and they don't think this kind of action is helpful. But this time, because the issues is directly related to what they consider important, then these kinds of selection, because of political stance, becomes a very almost become a common sense among the protesters. But for me, the even more important development is the mutual help circle, which looks like some of our ideal in social movement very much. That is, during the struggles, a lot of people are providing free drives and accommodations for young protesters to help them to escape from the site of the protest. And on the other hand, some of the people, especially the young protesters, are having economic problems because they are kicked out by the family because of political reasons. And now different organizations are setting up networks of lunchbox, which is who wants to cook for the protesters and who is going to deliver the lunchbox. So please sign up and we will provide the matching. And I'm glad to be part of this network. And on the other hand, there is also some emerging job platform, which is also trying to introduce new jobs to the protesters who lost their job. But once again, the coronavirus is a huge blow to this network because of the fear of pandemic, people are not willing to go outside. So now we have much fewer public meetings, and people are not going to eat outside to avoid being infected. So now it's also a new problem. So actually the coronavirus is a really unexpected turn for the struggle, because the struggle plus a sudden pandemic are having really strange in chemistry. So now providing some, of course I'm not sure how in America it is discussed, but let me just talk about some background. So the new coronavirus, which I would prefer calling it Wuhan coronavirus, starts spreading in central part of China since December of 2019, and the Chinese government and the World Health Organization keep lying about it, both for the number of infections, the number of deaths, the rates of infections, and up to now, just within 1 month, there are more than 40,000 of infections and 1,000 deaths. And it creates a huge panic in Hong Kong because 17 years ago, the SARS, which are the same type of virus, outbreak in Hong Kong in the same way. And that is because the Chinese government is hiding the facts about this disease, that at last there are 299 Hong Kong people were killed by the disease, and more than 1,700 people were infected. And in the infections, that there are 8 of the medical workers were killed by the disease, and that is one source of huge public anger actually. And it looks like that after 17 years, the same thing is happening again. So it is a very huge public panic. So one of the very important calls is a call for closing the border between Hong Kong and China in order to stop the virus from spreading. And to have some background, the Hong Kong-China border is the busiest border in the world. That is, every day there are more than 200,000 people are going back and forth. However, after the outbreak of the pandemic, the government is not taking any actions, including not closing the border and not providing sufficient protective clothing and facial masks for the medical workers and also for the general public, or not even informing the public on the security. And so the distrust against the government is combined. And so 2 weeks ago, there are 15,000 hospital workers strike for 5 days. That is the biggest organized strike in Hong Kong for half a century. And on the other hand, the flight attendants and metro workers are planning for strike as well, partly because partly as a political reason and partly for the job security and for the work safety issues, because their company is also refused to provide sufficient protection for them, and many local flight companies are still forcing the workers to take part in the flights to mainland China. But now, at least now, there are already 6 flight attendants under quarantine because of direct contact with some suspected patients of coronavirus. Okay, so this is a very brief introduction on the recent development, but I want to talk about 2 more things, which are some issues which are still not fully developed, but I think those are very important issues which worth expanding through the struggle. First, it is this one. This is a graffiti in the wall of Legislative Council. When the protesters broke into this building in the 1st of July last year, they made a spray paint about of it. It's called "China will pay for its crimes against Uyghur Muslims." I hope you know what this slogan is about. It is related to the, maybe you have already heard about it. It is in the northwestern part of China. About half of the people are not ethnic Han Chinese, but they are Uyghur, Kazakhs, or Kyrgyz. Yeah, or Kyrgyz. Many of them are Muslim, but in recent 3 years, the Chinese government are building huge concentration camps, which are detaining these people, and inside there are forced labor and lots of different issues are happening. And it is a very rare case for the Hong Kong protesters to connect our own struggle to what's happening in China or any other parts of the world. So so this is one of the very important development, I think, which worth further expansion. And the second part, the second issue is this one. This is the actions in the 24th of August last year, and you can see in these photos the protesters are pulling down a lamp post. So why the protesters are pulling down the lamp post? It is not a simple lamp post for lighting. Actually, it is a lamp post for surveillance, because these all the non-lighting parts of it are actually high resolution cameras and also RFID sensors, which is already installed in a lot of parts of China as part of the surveillance system, which combine with the AI of facial recognition or movement recognitions to identify everyone and to identify their so-called illegal behaviors. So on the 24th of August, where we have these actions to oppose the government's project of installing these kinds of surveillance lampposts all over Hong Kong. And some people made the analogy of the photos in a lot of uprising that people are pulling down the statue of a dictator with these photos. But I think this action is even more important than pulling down the statue of a dictator or something like this, because it is not targeting to any particular person or political party but I would say it is a symbol to provide. It is a symbol of protections for privacy, which is very important, because surveillance is something which is expanding in all parts of the world. Yeah. So I think I should stop here. So
Cool. Thank you, Al. We got a late start, but we probably have a little bit of time for like questions or discussion, especially with the expertise that's in the audience. The folks are here with some experience or some analysis. Maybe we can share it. What are you thinking? Yep.
China's changing its relationship to the world in the last 10 years. That's its plan for the next 50 years. So people say, so how's that going to affect what happens in Hong Kong? Changes in their economy, political
allies. The question, I'm going to try to repeat it so I'm correct. Yeah. The China's role in the world, politically and economically, is changing, probably. And how will that affect the situation in Hong Kong? I mean, one effect we already saw is Hong Kong became like a political football between the Beijing and the U.S. So that there's no escaping that like any struggle that happens in Hong Kong or domestically in China will be like over determined by the inter-imperialist rivalry between the two. What else? Please.
So you had mentioned that one of the options for Beijing with coronavirus and the general state of the economy is not suppressing the movement in Hong Kong. So I just wanted to ask generally if the options are generally between repression and co-opting. What ability does Beijing have to provide some kind of reforms or grant some of the demands of this movement to make it go away?
So it's sort of a carrot and stick question. We spoke a little bit about the constraints that Beijing faces in repressing the movement. If it has an option of co-opting and an option of sort of repressing, what are its potential strategies? What can it offer the movement to find it out? That's why I was interested to hear a bit from Aldo about the effect of the recent round of elections, right? Because it seems like that's a potential exit, like an off-road, right? Because it returns to the strategy of electing parties to the district council and negotiating with Beijing toward universal suffrage. But if that fails to satisfy the movement, then you're back in the same position. Don't wanted to respond to the first question and make me circle back to the second question. So, go ahead. I'll shoot unless you're muted, maybe. There you are.
Oh, okay. I think there's if I didn't hear it wrong, I think you talk about how as China is increasing in its power, so how will it affect different aspects of Hong Kong? Did I make it wrong?
That's right.
Okay. Can you see this slide? Okay. I think it is not just an issue in Hong Kong, but it is also but it is also at first it is a problem in China first. That is when we are looking back in the past decades, we can see there are a lot of huge changes in China. I'm not sure how much you know about the situation in China, but I can tell that the degree of freedom in China is actually shrinking very rapidly in recent 5 years. That is at first the Chinese government is repressing the local civil organizations, including the lawyers, the feminist groups, the labor activists, and a lot of different other kinds of research bodies. This is the first step. And on the other hand, it is expanding its surveillance system really rapidly. It is expanding its surveillance system really rapidly in a lot of ways. Like say for example, it is now collecting personal information in a lot of aspects, including email, online shopping, train tickets, or when you are going to buy a SIM card, the company will need your ID card. And if you are going to register an email, you have to give your phone numbers. So which means that when you are getting an email, your identity information is already registered. And on the other hand, it is monitoring the motions of people. Like everyone who are going to rent an apartment inside a community in the cities will have to register. And there are much more laws to provide power for the governments to do surveillance or to take brutal actions, include the anti-terrorist law or anti-spies law, and now trying to cut off the fundings and cooperations of the local civil society with the rest of the world. And maybe you have already heard about the Chinese censorship system in the internet. In the past, it is just by some people who are hired by the government, which we may call the 50 cents rumor, because of there are some rumors saying that every piece of job will have them paid for 50 cents. But now the responsibility of censorship is not only lying on the government, but there are laws that they require the internet service provider to do the censorship. And that's why the company of Weibo or WeChat have to actively delete the posts of people. And on the other hand, they are also controlling the academics. So this is what's happening in China. And this kind of authoritarian development is only expanding to Hong Kong in recent years. So I would say that as the power of the Chinese government is growing, it is having much more resources, and it is becoming more confident, so that it doesn't mind the opinions of it. I mean, it no longer need to please the general public or to please the international community, and that is how it and not only affecting the places within the Chinese territory, but also expanding its influence to outside the Chinese territory by different kinds of means, like
So speaking to the second question, then, does that imply? Oh, where's my head going? Oh, the strategy for the Chinese state in Hong Kong might be kind of like a slow strangulation and surveillance, like wait out the movement and its ability to do anything.
Oh, sorry.
It's an ambiguous answer. I got a question here. One thing I'll add before that question is that, and another back there. There's a great interview in the second issue of Chuang, interestingly, which includes some information I didn't know, which is that a portion of the would-be reformers within the Chinese Communist Party for a time viewed the legislative model in Hong Kong as sort of a potential alternative. Like we might try to duplicate this model in other sorts of cities. It allows some popular participation. It lets the new emerging capitalist elites have an outsized role. But I mean, obviously, none of us get in on those conversations of what's going on in Beijing. But the movement in Hong Kong has probably sunk that possibility. Right? So it's also having some effect inside China, inside the elite, on what they consider their future trajectory to be. Let's take 1 and 2.
I had a question for anyone in the room as well. As far as all of the interesting developments recently with struggle plus responses to the coronavirus, it was interesting that it has led to this faster unionization, and so like the strike that happened last week and then this upcoming strike that I hadn't heard about, probably for good reason. I was wondering if there was, in addition to sort of turning this struggle towards like more struggle against the government, to like say, government, you're not doing what you need to do, if there's also like sort of a mutual aid conversation going on in like the forums or in the organizers against the potentially highly antisocial effects of panic in response to this, like sort of like we don't need the government, like we can take care of ourselves in ways, like is there any sort of like conversation going on in that regard?
I'm repeating it for. So the question is in the recent strikes and actions around the coronavirus. What's the mutual aid dimension of what's going on, especially around public panic about the disease? Let's maybe take a second question and then we can go around. It's also a question for everyone in the room.
I think it's a fantastic question. I'd love for people to reflect on that. Thank you for asking it. I guess just to start, I want to say I'm really inspired that there's a full room that came out to hear this. I know that there's a lot of times with the way that this had begun, the question of like, what do we learn about struggles that are happening outside of the United States? We may get these tiny snippets or maybe even some of the tools or tactics of what other uprisings are using. And then that may be one of the most immediate things that we latch onto in thinking about how to create struggle more effectively here. So I know that a lot of people were inspired at the lasers and the barricades and the umbrellas and the hand signals, and I'm asking like, how can we adopt those things to be more effective in street actions here? And also, I was really inspired that there was a much longer and historical attempt at describing like what's the strategy behind these demonstrations that are really deserving of this kind of study. In thinking about the question of like the politics moving to the economic and those being very much in flux, this last week and a half, my social media was either between people who had volunteered for Bernie Sanders in New Hampshire or people who had been at the Fuck the Police demonstrations. And I'm giving that as an example because I think it maybe is another way of thinking in more local dimensions at this question of the politics and the economic. I feel like a lot of times we're trying to get a sense of how to develop power, and the most immediate example we have about that is a kind of representational power through the electoral system and supporting different candidates, Bernie or otherwise. I think also one of the things that people saw in the aftermath of the FTP demonstrations against police violence in the MTA was politicians coming up and saying, well, let me get in on this because there's now some traction on it. And I guess I'm wondering, beyond representational politics, what a more mass character of politics could look like that pays attention to our economic strength, what that could look like here in similar ways that it's starting to emerge in Hong Kong with these strikes. And maybe another thing, just riffing a little bit on this previous question, how these mutual aid networks can also be a way that, that there's a culture of supporting movements, but also one that could not be easily isolated and crushed by the state, or in the spirit of the NGOization of the United States, the state being fully okay with there being these mutual aid networks because that lets them off the hook with caring for people's lives. And maybe just very last thing to say as an anecdote, a friend of a friend was in China recently and saw someone asking for money on the street panhandling, and their means to receive a donation was through a QR code. There's not really any kind of money exchanged, tangible, physical cash that is exchanged. It's all done electronically. You need to have a bank card to be able to basically exist in China at the moment, including if you're unhoused and asking for a donation, you show someone a QR code. So giving that example just to say that the last image that Audo had shared about surveillance and just that the way that existing in society is changing. That's also something that I think people should be trying to take very seriously here, and not just seeing it as this dystopian, bizarre thing that's happening over there, but yeah, there are ways that it's also emerging here in the United States.
So a question about tactics. How can tactics from Hong Kong be applied in our own context? A question about the relationship between political and economic in mass struggles. How do mass struggles break from kind of representational politics and develop more mass power? And re-emphasizing the importance of struggle against surveillance. Or anyone else, would you like to speak to either of those questions? I don't have a good answer about mutual aid and coronavirus.
I can talk about a bit about it. But one of the I think that is a very important question. That is actually the mutual aid network, which was developed during the struggle to rescue us from even faster outbreak of the coronavirus. The reason is because there is a very strange connections between the struggle and the coronavirus. And one of the aspects is that the more you hate the governments, the more you do not trust the government's information on the coronavirus. And that's why it is that's the protesters or the pro-protest people are the first one who buy the facial mask, or the first to wear the facial mask, and the first to remind other people to protect themselves. So and during this period in Hong Kong, there's lots of panic buying. It's really crazy. People are queuing up in front of the pharmacies for hours to buy some masks. Or people are buying up all the rice and toilet paper in the supermarkets because they are afraid of something happening. But but now it is also the mutual networks which were developed during the struggles are trying to bulk purchase these resources and deliver it to the people who most need it, like the street cleaning workers or the older people. So, but still, I think it would be too fast to talk about and do not need the government, because in some larger issues we still need much more powers to handle the problem. Say for example, if the food Hong Kong is a place which there are almost all the resources we need are imported from outside, including food and all the groceries or all the different kinds of goods. So So now there's already some big trouble with the import of the medical protection stuff. But this is just the medical protection stuff, but not mentioning the food or some other aspects. So and not to mention the border aspect. So I think it is still too fast to talk about. Do not need the government, because I think now it is just the beginning for us to do something beyond representative politics. That now we think that the government is so crappy that we should help ourselves, but it is just a very, very beginning. And another friends just mentioned about how in mass struggle to avoid representative politics or overcome representative politics. I think one of the very important features in this struggle, in the current struggle in Hong Kong, is that we do not want any representative, and no one is going to become the representative. It is partly from the lessons of the failure of the umbrella revolution in 2014, because during that time we already realized that no one is capable to represent such a huge mass, and those who are going to represent will become the target of governments, and become the target to be blamed during the internal conflicts. So in the very beginning in this struggle, we are already talking about we do not need a leader, but everyone can do their own stuff towards the same goal. And I think, but there's some major difference between a horizontal organizing of movement and this kind of attitude, because there are very little discussion on. There are a lot of discussion on tactics, but there are very little discussion on values and long-term goals, and this is one of the problem. And the attitude of okay, we can do we can work on our own stuff and for the same goal is actually one way to avoid this kind of discussion and conflicts in ideology. So, but still, although we know there's this kind of there's this kind of weakness, but still we cannot figure out how to do that.
Thank you, Al.
All right, I think it's pretty late, and we just want to close the event. Thank you all for coming and for sharing in this conversation with us. We really appreciate it, and thank you, Al, for Skyping in and sharing your thoughts, especially so early in the morning. Just a quick note: there's stuff in the back that people can check out, and also if people do want to donate to send masks to people, I'm sure one of the ways that mutual aid is happening is through the diaspora here. Thank you. Oh, okay, and we're going to be hanging out later too if y'all want to join us at Antler, a nearby bar.
Across the way, down the block.
Thank you.